Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another video. Wanted to do a forecast discussion today as we have a pretty unique setup on tap from parts of the Midwest down into the Southern Plains. The SPC has outlined an enhanced risk level 3 out of 5 in the orange shaded region here from parts of central Missouri eastward into southern Illinois, southwest Indiana, western Kentucky, northwest Tennessee. That is where our greatest threat for severe weather is expected to be today, with a large slight risk extending around that and down into parts of South Texas. All hazards on the table for today. Tornado threat is going to be maximized in the enhanced risk area. 5% tornado risk outlined there, with a low end 2% risk extending all the way down into the slight risk into South Texas. Large to very large hail, though, is expected to be the greatest threat for today. Perhaps significant hail, 2-3+ inches in diameter, particularly in the 30% hatched region here across parts of central Missouri eastward into southwest Illinois. Really in the first couple hours of the convective life cycle before the storm mode changes. Again, we'll talk about that in just a second. But that should be our favored time frame for large to very large hail in that corridor. And then we could see some large hail producing storms down to the south into Texas. Damaging wind also going to be a threat as well for today, particularly in the enhanced risk area. So all hazards on the table for today. Not really a setup that's been on a lot of folks' radars, but it is kind of a unique setup, and I've seen some stuff on social media that I wanted to address as far as a particular analog to this event. So we'll talk about that here in just a second. This is really going to be our last severe weather event for some time. The long-range models are showing quite a pretty quiet period coming up for the next week plus before things look like, based on some of the long-range models and some of the climate teleconnection stuff, that we could see a pretty drastic uptick in severe weather activity across the central and southern U.S. And eastward, going into late April toward at least mid-May. So this is going to be our last event for a while, so I wanted to do a video today to cover that threat before we kind of shut things down for a little bit going into late April. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. First, let's show you what's going on right now on the radar. A few stronger storms here across eastern Kansas into western Missouri. A couple bands of storms here, one moving into central Missouri as we speak, and then one back here into Kansas with some additional development looking pretty likely down there to the southwest. This is all expected to move off to the east today. This probably will be part of our afternoon round, our main round of severe storms later. And we could see a rejuvenation, or we are expecting to see a rejuvenation of this activity and a strengthening of this activity as it moves into the better air mass to the east, and that air mass kind of destabilizes going into the afternoon. And so this will be part of that activity for the afternoon, with some additional development expected farther to the south and southwest. Let's start off, as always, with our upper air maps. This is the SPC mesoanalysis page showing the 500 millibar map at present. Not much going on across the country. Big old closed trough centered here across southern Canada, with mostly zonal flow down to its south across much of the U.S., especially here into the central U.S. Mostly just west to east flow rounding the base of this trough. Some slightly stronger flow, kind of in a glancing fashion here across the central U.S. into the Midwest. So maybe a few ripples rotating through the flow, but not a whole lot, not one of these deep digging trough type setups that we've seen so far this year, and we often see here in the springtime. It's just kind of a glancing blow, a little bit of curvature in the flow, so that should be just enough to support, at least synoptically, the severe weather threat for today. But most of our severe weather, the impetus for severe weather in today's event is going to come from our surface boundaries. Let's take a look at the surface pattern here. And this is what we have going on. A little bit of a kind of counterclockwise circulation here, cyclonic circulation here, indicative of a cold front that is kind of sagged down here into the southern plains, surface low located up here into southern Canada, with a kind of a very wonky type setup here. Cold front stretching down into the southern plains. We'll take a closer look at the overall positioning of that front, but that is going to be our main boundary to initiate severe storms in today's environment. The cold front going to be moving off to the east, and that is going to provide the support at the surface to initiate storms in this environment. Not much as far as a low-level jet to speak of going into the afternoon today. We do see a little bit of a plume of low-level jet here impinging upon Oklahoma, Missouri, down to the south. 30 to 35 knots or so. So some semblance of stronger low-level shear in this environment, but we are expecting that to tail off a little bit as we go into today. Not too surprising there, given that we have a kind of lack of overall real deep synoptic scale support here. Not one of these deep digging troughs traversing the Rockies where we see significant Lee cyclogenesis. So just a broad kind of surface cyclone here associated with the frontal boundary, and we're going to see a little bit of a weakening of the low-level jet with time. So that's why tornadoes not not going to be too much of a threat today, but we could see a few tornadoes where that low-level jet does try to hang around a little bit, which is especially going to be prevalent in the Midwest, kind of Missouri eastward into southern Indiana, southern Illinois, southern Indiana, western Kentucky. Let's take a look at our raw surface data now, and you can see exactly where that cold front is situated. Clear wind shift across parts of the central plains into the Midwest, with more easterly or northerly winds across parts of Kansas, Missouri, into the Midwest, with more southerly flow to its south. So clear wind shift here, and I'll just kind of draw it in, just kind of roughly estimate where that wind shift is. Looks to be right in there, and we kind of go south across Oklahoma and into Texas. I'll show the southern plains sector here in just a second, but very rich moisture out ahead of that, at least at the surface, mid to upper 60s dew points, even some 70s dew points down here in Texas. So a very broad region of kind of a juicy low-level air mass to work with, and therefore we have a broad region of severe weather threat today. Let's go down to the southern plains sector here. We can see the southern end of that cold front kind of tailing off here into west Texas, northerly flow across the panhandle, southerly flow to the south. So clear wind shift there, and again, very broad area of rich low-level moisture to support the storm development today. Southerly flow out at the surface, that is expected to continue across this area, but the cold front is expected to move off to the east, as we'll have that trough kind of moving off to the northeast into Canada, and some ripples through the flow, helping to push that front off to the east, especially in across the northern portions of that front into the Midwest. So the front is expected to be somewhat progressive today. We should see that start to move off here quickly this morning going into the afternoon. We should see that progress to the east into the eastern half of Missouri and the Midwest going into the afternoon. So that is going to probably allow the storm mode to be a little bit messy up here to the north, just given how progressive the front is. Deep layer shear vectors are not all that parallel to the front. So that is going to be one thing that might lend to at least a little bit of a window for semi-discrete supercells, but we should see an eventual transition to more of a mixed mode event, semi-discrete supercells, some embedded supercells with some line segments here across the Midwest, as the cold front just is very progressive in this particular setup. A couple of soundings to look at here. We'll take a look at some soundings across the region. We'll start here first at Nashville. Nashville here, maybe just off to the east of the main area of storms for today, but we can see somewhat shallow moisture here at the surface, 67 over 65, before we have quite a bit of dry air aloft. Decent instability here already in place at Nashville. Wonky wind profiles again. We're a little bit displaced from the stronger flow aloft, so not all that surprising. And we should see deep layer shear strengthen off to the west. Let's take a look here at Springfield, Missouri. And that's exactly what we see. Deep layer shear, bulk shear up to about 40 knots or so. Plenty of shear for strong rotating updrafts. Low-level shear at this point, as we talked about, that low-level jet is a little bit stronger here across this region at this point. Going to wane a little bit as we go into the day. So that we may not see as much low-level curvature here in these hodographs, but strong low-level curvature in the hodographs at this point, indicative of warm advection. Strong low-level shear at this point, veering and strengthening winds with height. Thermodynamically, a little bit to be desired. Just a very, very shallow moist layer. That's what we've been dealing with these previous couple severe weather setups, is just very shallow moisture. Even though we've had maybe a few days to get that moisture into the region, not quite enough to really support a super robust severe threat because it's so shallow beneath this elevated mixed layer. Very steep layer, very deep layer of steep lapse rates aloft. Warm, dry, well-mixed air here, indicative of that elevated mixed layer moving in on the mid-level southwesterly flow atop the very shallow moisture. Not all that favorable for significant severe weather. But again, with the forcing in play today from the cold front and at least rich low-level moisture, which should be enough to support severe storms in this environment. And then down into Texas, let's take one at Dallas-Fort Worth. Once again, fairly shallow moisture beneath that steep elevated mixed layer, some drier air aloft. And then going down into southwest Texas, Del Rio here. A little bit deeper moisture down here into Texas. The moist layer extending up to about 850 millibars. Very steep lapse rates aloft, indicative of that elevated mixed layer. And the one unique thing about this setup down in Texas is that it is going to be quite unstable in the atmosphere, something we don't often see in mid-April. We already have about 2,500 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE here at Del Rio. Very fat CAPE already in the atmosphere. And that is expected to only continue to grow as we go into the afternoon. We'll have strong surface heating, continued moisture advection, temperature should rise into the 80s. So that should allow for very, very strong destabilization, verging on the extreme category for destabilization, upwards of 4,000 to 5,000 plus joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE. That is going to be pretty unusual for this time of year, but that is going to support very robust updrafts, capable of producing strong damaging winds and large hail. So that is going to be the main threat for Texas. Those damaging winds and large hail, given strong instability, really robust updrafts, could produce that strong hail, strong winds and large hail. So let's take a look now at some model data. This is the 12Z NAM coming in as we speak. And we'll take a look at the 500 millibar pattern first. So this is how it was initialized. You can see here just that big closed low over Canada. Nice belt of flow here into the northern plains, Great Lakes region, with just this glancing blow down here to the south across the central plains into the Midwest. I'll show you that as the trough kind of meanders there to the east in Canada. We'll just kind of have this glancing blow, slightly stronger flow trying to make its way down into that Missouri corridor there for maybe a little bit stronger deep layer shear to support more robust updrafts, hence the enhanced risk in that region. As we go down to the south, much weaker flow here aloft. As we get away from that, farther away from that trough with southern extent. A little bit of stronger flow aloft here, 25 to 30 knots or so, but definitely not super supportive of really robust strong deep layer shear, but we should have enough given the veering winds with height to support supercells in this environment down into Texas, despite the somewhat weaker flow aloft. Down at the surface, let's go ahead and take a look at our surface pattern. You can see exactly what happens. A little bit of a surface low here across the Kansas-Oklahoma border this morning. That is expected to move off to the east, kind of stretched out, sprawled out, kind of that banana-esque low that we like to call it in the storm chasing world. A little bit strung out, but still fairly decent surface low here moving off to the east. That should provide a little bit of extra impetus for severe weather out today across that Midwest corridor, maybe along the warm front. The warm front is actually located a little bit farther off to the north. So south of that warm front, and ahead of the cold front should be your favored corridor for severe storms, a little bit of extra oomph from that surface low. So that should perhaps allow maybe a little bit more backed low-level flow out here across this region to support a little bit higher of a tornado threat in that corridor. Down to the south, we'll still see that southerly low-level flow, but again, much weaker deep layer shear down here to the south. Should still support supercells, but not really any tornadic activity with very weak low-level shear away from that surface low and such. So let's go to our dew points. You can see how the dew points progress as well. That dew point really outlines the area where the cold front is located. The western extent of that is going to be that cold front position. And you can see it across northern portions of the risk area, closer to that enhanced risk. It really is quite progressive. You can see how far east it moves pretty quickly with time. So that is going to allow kind of the storm mode to degrade a little bit, perhaps enough to support initial discrete supercells in this environment. I'll zoom in here to this southern sector. And so we'll take a look quickly at our storm mode here. And again, given that it's a fairly progressive cold front across northern portions of the risk area, that should be enough to support some upscale growth into more of a mixed mode, kind of line segments and embedded supercells type thing. But we do see the shear vectors quite perpendicular to the initiating boundary across the entirety of the risk area. So that should allow for at least some window for discrete supercells here, at least in the early portions of the convective life cycle, perhaps across southwest Missouri eastward, and then the storm coverage will pick up as the progressive nature of the cold front takes over, going into eastern Missouri, southern Illinois, southern Indiana, western Kentucky. So I think we have some competing influences there as far as storm mode goes, but that should be enough to support a mixed mode event with all severe hazards possible up there. Farther to the south, you can see that the cold front does not really move all that much. The dry line kind of stays put for a while, but that cold front does eventually kind of zipper down into the region. You see the cold front here back to the west dry line. I'll draw that in green here, down to the south. And we get what's called a zippering type effect. You see as the cold front surges down, it kind of overtakes the dry line, and that is going to allow for enough forcing for storms to go in this region. You can kind of see this kind of concave or convex, whichever one it is, their portion of the dry line. That's kind of being the cold front pushing down on that dry line, zippering down the dry line, and this is expected to be the main initiating mechanism for storms today as the forcing increases, as the dry line convergence increases along that composite boundary as the cold front overtakes the dry line there across north and central Texas. Now, this is very similar to an event that happened 26 years ago, the Gerald Texas F5, infamous F5 event. I've seen a lot of comparisons to this event on social media. We did have a very similar type setup where we had the overall trough up to the north. The main forcing was well off to the north. This was the 500 millibar map from Corfidi et al. I did a breakdown on the Jarrell event previously. I'll put a link to that in the description below so you can do some more digging there. But I used this paper in that video, And this has some great stuff as far as the upper air pattern and the surface observations as the event went on. So this is from the morning of May 27, 1997, 500 millibar map, very similar to what we're seeing today, with the trough quite a bit farther to the north, with just very weak forcing down here to the south. Not much forcing at all, very weak deep layer shear. And that's exactly what we're expecting to see down here today. And we also saw that kind of zippering action from the cold front overtaking the dry line. You can see here, this is at 12Z. Your cold front back in here, dry line back in here, and the cold front eventually does take over the dry line. You can see here the cold front and dry line, the distance between those two very much decreases with time. That's at 15Z, 16Z, 17Z, 18Z. The cold front is almost completely overtaking the dry line, and as that happened, we got thunderstorm initiation here on the dry line, and kind of storms zippered down that boundary as the cold front overtook the dry line, and we got some tornadic activity out of that setup. And this is again going to be a very similar type setup, but we have to remember that Jarrell was a once-in-a-lifetime type event. That was a very, very unique event, and my video goes through that. Again, I'll put a link to that in the description box below. There was some really, really unique boundary interactions that took place with this, with the Jarrell setup. We also had a gravity wave in play that may have aided things in that environment. So even though the overall skeleton, the bones of this setup today are very similar to the Jarrell event, we have to remember how rare and unique the Jarrell setup was. So there were very unique boundary interactions at play that day. And to get that, we talked about it in that video, you have to get things just right in an environment where you don't expect to see tornadoes. You have to have something that's going to really influence and bump up either the low-level shear or surface vorticity, something to get tornadoes in a weak, low-level shear environment. And today we just we're not expecting to see that. And I really hate the comparison to Jarrell because it is such a once in a lifetime event and a very unique, very, very unique event. Whereas today this is not all that uncommon of a setup. Not to say we won't see tornadoes out of this setup along the surface boundary. We should see some enhanced vorticity with such strong instability at play, especially low-level instability. We could see a tornado or two along that boundary, but it is not expected to be a very significant tornadic event. Large hail and damaging winds certainly going to be the main threats with this setup. And I'll take a sounding here out ahead, kind of in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, just to show you what we're talking about here. So this is going to be an observed sounding, and you can see here this is a pretty awful looking photograph for tornadic activity. And not the Jarrell setup had the same thing, but again, the boundary interactions were so unique in the Jarrell setup that it is very unlikely that that is going to happen again anytime soon, especially in this setup. We do see very strong instability, 3,300 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE. This is at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time, but that photograph certainly not favorable for any tornadic activity. You're gonna and that's why we saw at Jarrell. You need some really, really specific and unique boundary interactions to get tornadic activity in a setup like this. And again, those were kind of once in a lifetime type setups. So I know I keep harping on that, but I don't like the comparisons to Jarrell because it was such a unique event. This event happens fairly often, and tornadic activity is the tornado threat is very, very low. You're going to need something really perfect to happen, like I said, to get tornadoes today in this kind of a setup. And so the main threat, again, is going to be large hail and damaging winds. So for folks who are worried about this kind of a setup being like Jarrell, definitely don't worry about that. Not to say that we can't get significant tornadoes from this type of setup, but it is going to take something pretty monumental with this kind of a wind profile. You can see here, deep layer shear only at 20 knots. And so we probably will have a little bit of aiding from the vorticity along the boundary being ingested into these storms, perhaps making them kind of transient supercells. But overall, this is just very weak deep layer shear, very, very, very limited low-level shear. You can see effective storm relative helicity at about 11 there. That is just pretty terrible. So mostly going to be a large hail and damaging wind threat today. Not expecting to see any robust tornadic activity with this setup. Farther to the southwest, down into central Texas, very strong instability, 4,500 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE, 89 over 71. Could even see those temperatures get into the 90s, which would mean very well mixed low levels, indicative of strong outflow winds. And we could see some large hail, although sometimes you can have too much instability to get very large hail. So, but the large hail threat is expected to be pretty significant today, so that needs to be taken into consideration. Up here to the north, across this area of Missouri into Illinois and Indiana, Take a sounding from up here ahead of the eastward advancing cold front. This is going to be again at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. And you can see that we don't have much low-level shear to work with in this setup. As we said, the low-level jet is expected to wane as we go into the afternoon today. And so it looks like damaging winds and large hail going to be the main threat with those storms up there. Plenty of instability, 2,000 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE, 81/64 at the surface. So that in deep layer shear favorable for supercells, and that is going to be deep layer shear of about 40 knots or so. So plenty of deep layer shear for organized rotating updrafts, but your low level shear very, very weak across this corridor, and therefore should be mostly a large hail and damaging wind threat there. Just want to take a sounding maybe up a little bit farther to the northeast, where we may have a little bit more backed low level flow, just to see if we could see a little bit better photograph. Yeah, that would be a little bit better. Not a ton of curvature there in the lowest kilometer or so of the atmosphere, but perhaps enough to support a low-end tornado threat. 165 meters squared per second squared effective storm relative helicity with pretty decent instability. Should foster a threat for a tornado or two with the storms up there, but again, degrading storm mode with time, fairly weak low-level shear. Should foster mostly a large hail threat initially, and then more so a damaging wind threat as the storm mode degrades with time. Continued eastward advance of that cold front going into tomorrow. Things kind of settle down there in Texas, and then we should see a waning of the severe threat for quite some time after this. All right, let's close out the video here with some convection allowing models. We'll take a look at the 12Z HRRR first. I'll start off with the Midwest sector, and then we'll move to our Southern Plains sector for the southern portion of the risk. So here we are, 12Z HRRR, showing some of that activity that we saw earlier in the video across eastern Kansas, western Missouri, moving off to the east as we go into the afternoon. And again, that is expected to be part of that afternoon main round of severe storms. You can see some embedded supercells in there, some fairly semi-discrete supercells initially across this region. By about 2 to 3 p.m. or so. Then we move off to the east, and your storm mode kind of degrades with time going into the early evening hours. We get a little bit more of a clustered linear mode here, kind of a mix of supercells and line segments across this region. Could see a few severe storms down here across southern Tennessee, southwest Tennessee, Arkansas into Mississippi. A couple stronger storms there, a little bit of a speed max moving through there. Didn't really mention that earlier, but I'll show you back here on the 500 millibar map. So we are expecting to see maybe a little bit of stronger flow here moving across this region, a little bit of a ripple in the flow moving into the Louisiana-Mississippi corridor. Could be enough to initiate some isolated supercells down there, and that is what the HRRR is showing, a few supercells possible down into that mid-south into southeast region. But our main threat, of course, going to be up here in that enhanced risk area, a mix of supercells and line segments capable of all severe hazards. Let's go down to the south as well, in the Texas portion of the risk. And you can see a few supercells do kind of develop there across North Texas, southeast Oklahoma as well, along the cold front as it starts to overtake the dry line. And you can kind of see that zippering action. The storms kind of move to the south or southwest even as that zippering action occurs. And again, those could foster that large hail to damaging wind threat. And as we go into the evening hours, the instability will wane, will start to stabilize the low levels, and therefore the storm coverage will decrease going into the evening hours. And we should be good to go a few hours after sunset there. All right, let's take a look at another model here. How about the ARW model? Just another convection allowing model we like to use to get a picture of what the atmosphere might look like later on. So almost looks like a bit too much convection up here in Missouri as progged by the ARW here, so keep that in mind with this particular solution. But we do see that kind of get rejuvenated going into the afternoon hours. A few supercells, some line segments here across Missouri, southern Illinois. So that would be foster that all hazards threat. Some stronger storms down here into the mid-south and southeast, Mississippi River Delta down there. Widespread area of severe threat today, a couple different regimes. And then we'll go into the Texas portion of the risk. And we can kind of see the same thing. We get supercells to fire here by probably 3 p.m., 4 p.m. or so along the cold front, southeast Oklahoma, southwestward into Texas. And those become robust pretty quickly, kind of that zippering action. You can see here, as modeled, these kind of fine lines out ahead of these storms indicative of strong outflow winds. Even though we have very strong low-level moisture, those temperatures are expected to be pretty high in this setup, probably in the upper 80s, perhaps even the low 90s. Especially with southwestward extent, so that could allow for more of those outflow production with those storms. Again, large hail going to be a threat as well. And then storms will wane as we go into the hours after sunset. One more model here, NSSL WRF model. This is going to be for our northern portion of the risk, some convection there moving into Missouri. Pretty good handle on that as far as this model goes. Then by about 2 to 3 p.m. or so, we start to see the uptick in convective intensity there. A couple supercells moving into Missouri and Illinois. And then we kind of get more of a linear mode going on as we go into the early evening hours there. A couple stronger storms down to the south as well. So these models are pretty much on the same page for this setup. And we'll take a look here for the southern portion of the risk. And I expect we'll see pretty much the same thing as we saw in the other models. You can see the fine line there. That is our cold front down here. And then we see storm initiation there, 2 to 3 p.m. across North Texas. It's close to the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Kind of zippers down the boundary with that damaging wind threat. Very strong outflow progged by these models. So looks like damaging winds going to be the main threat here with some large hail. And then we see a waning of the convective intensity after dark. So the models are pretty much on the same page here today. Mid-afternoon, storm initiation across these areas. Again, the portion of the risk up north in Missouri, going to see the continuation of convection from this morning and a kind of rejuvenation of that convection going into the afternoon. Down to the south, a couple stronger storms, and then into Texas, we'll see initiation kind of mid-afternoon or so along the cold front as it overtakes the dry line. So that's what we have going on for today. All hazards risk on the table. Again, an enhanced risk level 3 out of 5 in the orange shaded region from the central portion of Missouri, Jefferson City, St. Louis, under the gun there, Evansville, Indiana, under the gun for that greatest severe threat today in the enhanced risk. Large slight risk surrounding that extending down into south central Texas. Does include the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, Little Rock, Waco, under the gun for that level 2 out of 5 risk, mostly that large hail and damaging wind risk there. Tornadoes, as we said, are going to be a threat, 5% risk in the enhanced area. Again, I think it's going to be mostly a damaging wind threat with some large hail, especially up here in this portion of the risk area and along the dry line and cold front down there in Texas. Given somewhat weaker low-level shear, but up here in the Missouri corridor eastward, could be that greatest threat for a few tornadoes down along the dry line. Again, not to say we won't see any significant tornadic activity down here. We have that Jarrell analog, but again, I just hate using that analog because it was so unique. But we could see a tornado or two, given strong vorticity along the boundary, strong low-level stretching of that vorticity with strong low-level instability. So tornado or two, definitely possible along the cold front, but again, the main threat's going to be large hail, especially 15% hashed area down into south central Texas, 30% hashed area into Missouri, southwest Illinois, for some large to very large hail, and damaging winds going to be a threat with this convection as well. So that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.